I was fascinated this morning by all the discussions about what are we going to do with all the profits we make from these neglected diseases. I got invited by TI Pharma, so apologies to those of you who were here 4 weeks ago or wherever we were 4 weeks ago, to talk about what we do in terms of public-private partnerships, product development partnerships, and filling the gap. Remember that our job here is to overcome market failure. So one of the questions is, when people like me stand up and put up a slide about how much money we've raised, the real question is not how much money did you raise, but what sort of leverage did you get? In other words, if I can develop a drug for $43 million, which is what we did, that's great. If I could develop it for $10 million by getting somebody else to pay $33 million, preferably the company, that's even better. If I could develop it for nothing by getting somebody else to do the work, that's success. And I think that's one of the things to look at when you're talking about investing in neglected tropical disease, then that's really the take-home message is, can you get yourself out of business? So I've sat in the negotiating room with several people where they've said, to hell with you. Believe me, there are people that don't always like me. They say, you tell me why we shouldn't just develop this drug and launch it without the help of MMV. And you say, that's success. Okay? So in that background, we start with looking at where the market failure is, and I think that's the best place to start. So in the last quarter of the last century, there was something like 1,300 medicines developed and delivered to the marketplace, of which only 1% were for neglected tropical disease. Everybody's seen that. What most people don't read is that that 1% were actually all old drugs. So there's no innovation really probably from about 1990 onwards. And it was restricted as the pharma industry pulled out. I put up there as a figure, in 2005, then maybe 9% of the patients had the best access to malaria treatments. In 2002, that number was 1%. So don't forget as well, it's not just developing the drugs. And for those of you who sort of worry about how you put this into context, and those of you who aren't interested in malaria, so I'm glad to see the Dutch Foreign Ministry have gone, because we spent a lot of time trying to convince them that, yeah, you're still here, good. You're still there, hey, good. So we spent a lot of time trying to convince people that it can't really be a neglected disease if 1 million kids are dying every year. And we talked before about, what is the performance metric? How many lives do you have to save per $1 million for something to be worthwhile? But if you accept that malaria is an area where we have actually quite good funding and we have quite good success rates, then one of the questions is, what do the lessons that we learn in this disease area have to say in another disease area? Because one of the big issues across most of the audiences that I work with, most of the groups I work with, is people are still really focused and really siloed, and we'll get back to that. So we might look at the little girl with the goat on the left, say, what is she going to die of in terms of neglected disease? Ask the question, what is the little girl on the right going to die of? My parents will die of cancer, will die of heart disease. I'm probably going to fall down the steps of this lecture theatre and die of a gram-negative infection that I catch in this hospital. Yeah? So don't forget that what we do for neglected disease, whether it's bacterial infections, whether it's psychiatric disease, will affect us all tomorrow. So briefly, malaria. Sorry. 800,000 deaths. What's interesting is that most of the patients are under 5, and most of those are under 2. So this is an area that most pharma industry doesn't work in. Worse than that, then the disease also selectively targets pregnant women, which is an area, again, the pharmaceutical industry doesn't normally choose to work in. 250 million cases per year, and because we have also Vivax malaria in Southeast Asia and in South America, probably half the world's population at risk. Why worry? This is always an interesting slide to say, you can actually go, these are wonderful tables if nobody's ever done it. You can go to the WHO website and download what's going to happen to you depending on which income group you're in and also which part of the world you're in. But you can see, the two big neglected diseases that we haven't talked about at all today really very much are respiratory tract infections and diarrhea. So multi-causal diseases, but things that actually somehow get left off occasionally. Malaria comes in at number 5. Lots of people don't like this slide because their disease is normally number 11 at the bottom. But to say, the question is, what do you learn about your disease and how to treat it that's relevant to other disease areas? So MMV, as Trevor said, was started 10 years ago as a spin-off between the World Health Organization and the IFPMA. So I have to say that one slowly, as a sort of joint venture between the World Health Organization, a United Nations mandated organization, and the Institute of the Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Organizations. Basically, to try and address that gap. So can we discover, or at least can we catalyze, because we're a virtual organization, discovery, development, and delivery of new safe and effective anti-malarial drugs? How are we going to do it? So you'll notice we've got PDP up there, Product Development Partnership. In the Anglo-Saxon world, public-private partnerships, certainly in the British Anglo-Saxon world, got into a bad reputation because they're not the sort of things that brought the Blair government down. So we moved it to product development partnerships to say this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to develop products. So we're using public funds, we're using philanthropic funds, we're using private money. And the interesting question is not just from the pharma industry, but as was talked about before, what does a mining company think? What does an oil company think? What do companies that work in this part of the world think? And will they back up their thoughts with money? Can we bring together the pharma industry and the academic research institutions? Because like it or not, the pharma industry is where most of the experience used to be in terms of drug discovery. So 95% of the medicinal chemistry will always be in the pharma industry. But yet the academic research institutions, certainly for this area, is where the basic science and the clinical medicine is. And remember, we're trying to cure patients here. And getting them to work on a disease, giving the incentive to make it happen, filling that gap, knowing that if we filled that gap perfectly, we could retire and let everybody else get on. So a lot of this is down to networking. I said don't pay too much attention to where the money comes from. And you can see here that we have certain great governments like the Brits. The Dutch are actually up there as, I think, the #3 government. We get a lot of money from foundations, the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust. And if you look in detail, you can see some of the companies that have given us money. They say the real measure here is not how much money we got, but how much we leveraged it. So for every dollar we get from our donors, can we get $2 in contributions from our pharma partners, or from the universities, or from the countries we work in? As was said earlier this morning, this is all about partnerships. So basically, what we do is we bring people together and make them work together. I got into trouble at a meeting for saying, we have 2 tools. We have a gun and a checkbook, right? So, but the money actually makes a lot of difference in this world. But just getting people around a table and saying, you have to work together because people are dying out there as a result of not doing the work properly. So 140 partners, 45 countries. Does it work? Well, yes. I think the nice thing about the product development partnerships, if they don't work, you can shut them down, which is very different from government departments. So we have a couple of medicines launched. We have a couple with the European Agency, which is something worth saying. We took a stance that the only great arbiters of quality, and quality is really important here, right? There's lots of rubbish drugs out there which are being produced by fly-by-night companies in Africa and Asia. The quality standards have to be what we would want for ourselves. So WHO is a mandated guide to quality. Pre-qualification is the ultimate way to go forward. The European agency, the American agency help us to get the files together, which will keep the WHO happy. But in the end, we've got to have a standard which is acceptable, and we can't have second-class medicines going to Africa. We have a couple of things in pivotal studies, clinical studies, and a couple of other child formulations in development. We have 50 projects altogether. That's important because even in our world, we get failure. Right? So you have these wonderful graphs of portfolios. You should always look at them and say, if things fail at a normal rate, what's going to happen? We're going to be no more lucky than any other therapeutic area. Somebody asked earlier, how do we actually make decisions? We manage our portfolio by having clearly defined priorities, clearly defined target product profiles, international expert advisory bodies who are a mixture of people from academia, from clinical medicine, and from industry who are judging the projects, giving feedback. We have people who are managing the projects internally, largely coming from industry, project management experience. We go to the world and say, give us your proposals annually within a certain area. We assess them, and then we award grants. And then we manage the projects. If you like, the difference between us and a government grant is the amount of management we do on the projects. So how much, when projects aren't working, we change the teams around, how much we give them advisors. In some ways, it's a little bit like venture capitalists. Right, so forget the money side, but the venture capitalists, project managers are always over-managing the projects. That's the standard criticism. So if we're not getting feedback that says we're over-managing, then we're probably not doing our job. This is the global portfolio of all medicines in malaria. So the hatched ones are the ones we don't work on, and the solid ones are the ones in our portfolio. But to give you an idea, if you look at that line, then say the bright green in phase 1, a molecule at that stage has a 2 in 9 chance of getting to the marketplace, statistically based on anti-infectives. So that means if the portfolio looked full, we'd have 9 compounds in that box. So although we show a nice, looks full to you guys, say we're still only about half full from being able to launch a new medicine every 4 or 5 years. So it looks good, but it still could be better. What about the medicines themselves? So just to segue into what we're actually doing. So the standard of care for malaria, as most of you know, is an artemisinin combination therapy. Artemisinin is a Chinese natural product, which is put in combination with basically the little brothers of quinine. So chloroquine has moved on to things like lumefantrine, amidiaquine, and so on. These combinations are incredibly effective. In clinical trials, they're 98% efficacious. The big difficulty is not doing 2,000 patient studies in Africa. It's actually getting the formulation sorted out. So we have to put 2 drugs which are stable in 75% humidity. It's actually at 30 degrees C for 3 years. And the other challenge is that they have to be affordable. So chloroquine set basically a price floor that people expect these treatments to be about 10 cents. So when we say it's 25 cents for an infant and $1 for an adult, that's expensive for people. When we look at it, actually, one of the big areas, we're the first people to really start drilling down on what the cost of these medicines really is. Right? Most of the rest of the pharma industry is used to dealing with these massive markups. What's actually happening over the last 5 years, then the ACTs have started rolling out. So you can see in this graph, the dotted line is the number of malaria cases. The blocks are actually the drugs that are being received by the countries. You see there's basically, it's falling between the first drug, which is artemethyl-lumefantrine, and the Sanofi ASAQ, so the first 2 of those 4 drugs. What you can also see is there's some generics in there. So somebody was talking earlier about getting competition in. It's actually really good to get the high-quality generic competition in there because there's other players in the same market. The issue is actually, if you break these numbers down, that the generic companies are all going for the treatments of adults, which is where the big market is. So Novartis is always treating small children and very small children where there's no markup. So one of the issues is you bring the generics in, they're not nice guys. They're nice guys who are there to make lots of money. And so one of the questions is, if you can make all the money by treating the wrong patient group, then... So there's a little bit of negotiation got in there. But just to say, when we're talking about intellectual property, it's quite important to make sure that your intellectual property is sufficiently loosely held that you actually keep the market moving. I show a picture of my favorite Dutchman. So we have a project on artesunate for injection. This is an interesting one for the public health guys. That a big clinical study was done by Arjen Dondorp, who's in the picture. 2 big clinical studies showing that if you give artesunate, it increases your chance of survival in Africa by 30% over being given a quinine injection. The issue was that there was nobody making a high-quality generic, if you like, artesunate for injection. Sounds trivial, but you have a choice between working with an American company to lower the price or working with a Chinese company to get through the quality barrier. And you have to do both. So again, one of our roles is just to work with all the partners to make sure that the drugs become available. Does anybody here work on drug discovery? You all just checking if everybody's awake at this stage. Right, okay, so big debate. How do you find drugs? This is usually what I get invited to talk about when I'm let out from malaria. But say the big debates were, do you find the genome? Do you find lots of targets? This was all big science from the 90s and 2000s. Or do you do it the way we used to do it when we knew how to discover drugs in the 1980s, which is you find chemists, you make molecules, you put them together with pharmacology, physiology, and you find things that work. So just to say, knowing the target, I'm a structural biologist by training, so knowing the target, being able to design drugs is brilliant, as long as you know that the target is valid. In other words, there's already a drug in that class. So here's an example of one of those. Works really nicely. What we found, though, was a real shock. When we looked at what we were doing, and Trevor alluded to this in terms of productivity, we found that none of our target-based projects were working. You can imagine going back to the academic community and saying, actually, everything we've done on target-based has failed in the first 6 years. So we had a look at it and we said, okay, so like with a lot of people, that what we really need to do is we need to go back to biology. And since we can get the parasite and the real human cells into the 384 well plates, why don't we just screen? So we did that with Novartis initially and with GSK. Now we've done it with about 10 other different companies. And the two beautiful things about that, one is that the parasite is a lot stupider than you think, in that we found that about 1 in 200 compounds which were being screened were actually killing the parasite submicromolar. Now, nobody would have predicted that. The second was that because we had so many families of hits coming out, you could afford to junk all the ones you didn't like the look of, which meant you could move very, very fast to proof of concept in man. So we went from screens to human studies, phase 1, in just under 4 years with that Novartis compound. And again, nobody would have predicted that. The third thing is you take all these hits and you screen them against all the targets that you guys work on, you don't find anything. And the fourth thing is if you go looking for the targets, you find them and they're not the ones that most people are working on. So whatever else we learned from this exercise, we learned that the classical way that we've done drug discovery and anti-infectives over the last 20 years is not the way to do it. And there are much more efficient ways of moving forward. What we also learned was that actually the way we were doing chemistry was probably wrong. So we found, look around the room, there's quite a few of us in the room. Our world is full of retirees from the pharmaceutical industry. So the downsizing of the pharmaceutical companies meant there's a lot of expertise. It's quite easy to find a man or a lady with 30 years experience of pharmacology or of chemistry who wants to help on one of these projects. It's quite easy to find people who have chemistry expertise but don't really have the right strategic direction. So the Indian companies, the Chinese companies, we have projects in South Africa as well, where what they need is they need mentors, they need advisors for strategy. They don't need to be told what to do on a day-to-day basis. So we've actually worked with quite a few of our partners to drive down the costs of what we're doing by using that industry expertise, using those retirees, if you like, and on top of that, using the expertise out in the community. Quick advert, anybody who doesn't work on malaria should pay attention at this point. So what we've done is we distilled down by substructure searching, we distilled down those 25,000 compounds, because most people said they're not interested in 25,000 compounds, into a box of about 400. What we'd like you to do if you don't work on malaria is to test these against your favorite parasite. So we'll give you a box with all the compounds in, and then we'll put all the results up on the web, because one of the things that we don't really know is how well all of these drug series work against all the other diseases. You remember at the beginning where I put the first 10 causes of death up on the list, and you're upset with me because yours is number 16. Right? Remember, there is a disease that's at number 135 that nobody is ever going to work on and develop a drug because only 1,000 people die every year. What's going to happen there is you're going to do the same as you do in antibacterials. You're going to use a drug developed for a different indication and show that it works in yours. So actually understanding how these compounds work against different parasites, against any different portobiology is really important at this stage. Quick comment on natural products. I don't know how long I have. We did a lot of work on natural products and found nothing. So the world of natural products is very, very fond of the fact that you can screen, you find interesting things, and they sort of work at 50 micromolar, or 20 micromolar, or 10 micromolar. If you set the barrier the same as you would set for the screening that we did before, you find 1 or 2 compounds every year coming out. So what's interesting about natural products and malaria is, of course, we've had malaria in Africa, and this is probably one of the few areas that Africa could really drive forward, because we have natural products which are used to treat malaria and actually do treat people. So what we need to do here is actually characterize what goes on in humans by doing human observational studies, patient studies, and then go looking for the active ingredients. We have a couple of projects we're doing, one in Mali and one in DRC. What's interesting is that the natural products that work in patients don't work in mice. And do you know what the first reaction of the project team when they see that data is? They say, oh God, we'll stop. Yeah? So don't forget, if something works in man, in women, the question is how does it work? And that's what we really got to get to the bottom of, because that's how we found artemisinin in the first place, that's how we found quinine. Trevor mentioned performance indicators. I won't bore you with this, but one of the key things is to say we need to know how much everything costs, and we need to show that we're being completely competitive the whole time. The question is always competitive with relation to what? As I said at the beginning, I gave a talk for TI Pharma about 5 weeks ago, and we were talking about what do you learn from malaria that you can apply to other areas. So those are the 5 bullet points from that talk, which I won't give you now. But the first was to say, focus on the diseases that really matter. And those are going to be different from different points of view. But to say, the lessons that you learn from one disease will be applicable to the other. Second is sharing the early stage. That's why I was really interested in the talks about intellectual property. When we've got a product that's ready to launch, if you want to buy that off me, you're not going to pay me very much in malaria. If I have an Alzheimer's drug which is ready to launch, you'll buy it off me for $1 billion, maybe 2. If I have a malaria drug, you may give me 50p. I don't know. You may give me $1 million for it, worldwide rights, that sort of thing. So we can afford to share the early stage. So the point at which things become competitive and stop becoming pre-competitive in our world is actually quite late. So if I give you all the preclinical data we've ever got, and you steal it and work on it, that's great. And it's getting that mindset across to people that, you know, having an early idea isn't necessarily going to help you here. Third is innovation in the right environment. Bear in mind, I'm a complete heretic here. So I spent 10 years in industry doing wonderful stuff on immunology, lots of publications, lots of great fun. Actually, that's what went wrong with the industry. So academia has been forced to do industrial sort of stuff, drug development, and industry, bizarrely, was doing academic work. You figure that one out from the 1990s. So do the innovative stuff in the academic environment, and then innovate to develop in the companies. Escape from reductionism. This is a great place to talk about this. Most of the great discussions and most of the great breakthroughs in medicine were made by clinicians looking at patients. They were not made by enzymologists looking at X-ray structures. So again, thinking about what's best for the patient, what works for the patient is much more important than what works for the mouse. Finally, understanding cost. Hardly anybody that we work with understands their real cost structure. And that's one of the joys of working with people, is just bringing together how much does it really cost, how can you drive those costs down, because ultimately if you can drive your costs down far enough, you won't need any donor money. So I'll stop there. I say I have to apologize. It's school half term, which means I have to be on the 5 o'clock flight, otherwise I'm in trouble. If you have any questions afterwards for me and we don't get through them in the next 2 minutes, then I'm easy to find on the web. If you have any interest in what I was talking about testing malaria compounds, then drop me an email or give me a ring, because it really is important that we get some of those collaborations going. Just say thank you for all the work that you've been doing in terms of neglected disease. It really is important. And it's important not just for us and for the future, but for the future of these children in Africa. But I would say, you know, go back to the picture of my kids at the beginning, it's important for our kids as well. So thank you.
Tim, thank you very much indeed, and you'll now understand why we switched the program to let Tim get away. Any quick questions of Tim before he disappears?
With how many drugs are you satisfied if you produce 1 or 2 per 4 or 5 years? When will MMV stop?
Will MMV stop? Well, yes, soon. No. The first problem we had was that, I mean, I started 4 years ago with MMV, that the WHO and various other people came in and said, we're going to eradicate malaria. And if we're going to eradicate malaria, we need different classes of drugs from the ones we have at the moment. So we need new drugs which will stop transmission. So stop you, because the way you catch malaria, everybody thinks you catch malaria from a mosquito, but the mosquito has to catch the malaria from somebody else. And the way it works is the mosquitoes are inherently lazy. So if you have a family with 6 kids in there, they hop, they bite, they hop, they bite. So if you can stop the mosquito getting infected, you break transmission, and that's actually really good. And in fact, we don't have many drugs to stop the mosquito getting infected, because why would you work on that? So there are a number of different things. There's also with Vivax, Vivax is the Southeast Asian form that, sorry, it's up here, that actually hangs out in your liver and relapses. And again, there have been no new anti-relapse drugs in the last 60 years. So I think what we're starting to see is that there are actually 3 or 4 different objectives that we have now. If you look on our target product profiles, in theory, if we got 1 or 2 good drugs in each of those classes, we'd be away. And then the question is, how long will it take to do that? The other thing that's really important is the reason that we need new drugs is because the drugs that we have, the parasite gets resistant to. So in fact, if you could have one drug and you never saw resistance to it, you might have enough drugs to get rid of the parasite forever. So one of the questions at the moment is we have to really push hard to make sure that the drugs that we're developing do not have a propensity to generate resistance. So it's a little bit harder. When I gave the industry averages, then what we need to do is we need to be really tough on projects which are not really getting there with resistance generation.
Tim, you mentioned a lot about the portfolio, but I know that in recent years MMV has also been very concerned to ensure that it doesn't stop at registration but actually gets to deliver the product. So in a couple of minutes and very briefly, what are you doing in MMV to make sure the fruits of your labours actually get there?
I think there are a number of exciting things that have happened. So there's a really good project. If you never get a chance, if you've never seen it, then Novartis and the Swiss Development Corporation and us were involved in a project called SMS for Life. So basically, if you look at my statistics, you see that there are 160 million treatments going to Africa and Asia, and there are about 250 million cases. So in theory, then 2/3 of the patients should get the drug. What they did in Tanzania was they set up an SMS-based system. So I think you were talking about, somebody was talking about mobile phones earlier. So what happens is at the village dispensary, the guy gets paid, and he gets paid in mobile phone credits, which is brilliant. He gets paid every week for sending a list of all of the strengths of drugs that he has. And that means that every Wednesday midnight, you get a free map of what's going on in the world. And when they first got the map together, because it's done by the telecoms companies and Novartis and the Swiss Development Corporation, you see this map, which is entirely red, apart from a few green spots. So it tells you that there is enough drug out there to treat all the patients, it's just in the wrong place. And so I think it's solutions like that where you're saying that getting the drug to the country is one thing, and then getting the drug to the patients, when you look at the moment the effectiveness, so how good it is to get the drug to the patient, it's now the access problem that's the big issue.
Good. And maybe we can pick that up in the general debate afterwards about access and how you monitor it. Tim, off you go. Thank you very much indeed. Appreciate it.